Hello, I'm trying to create virtual life as real, complicated, and interesting as I can. So let me introduce you to it. I call this the Sqwee. A Sqwee can move up, down, left, or right. It can stop itself completely, or it can try to eat. When the Sqwee eats, it's surrounded by a green circle, and if there's a red food brick within that circle, the Sqwee will consume the food brick and gain 500 energy. The energy is important because without any energy, a Sqwee will flash blue and die. But if the Sqwee gets more than 2,000 energy, then the Sqwee will divide itself into an almost perfect duplicate and original. I'll talk more about what I mean by almost perfect in a little bit. The Sqwee live in this featureless black plane called the tank, on which red food pellets appear. About 60 red food pellets every second. Let's look and see what happens when we introduce some random Sqwee to this tank. When I say random Sqwee, I mean that the Sqwee just pick their actions at random. As you can see, the Sqwee kind of move about a bit like gnats. They start and stop and eat, and when there's lots of food, they'll grow more frequent. The Sqwees multiply. But the Sqwees don't really do anything that interesting. After all, this isn't really a simulation of digital life. This is more like an illustration of a random number generator. To be more interesting, we need to give our Sqwees a brain. So let's do that. How do we give our Sqwees a brain? Well, I have this concept of a brain tree. I'm not sure if this concept exists anywhere else or by a different name, but I've chosen to call it a brain tree. The brain tree is made up of nodes. Each node has a true branch, a false branch, and a hypothesis. The hypothesis is a statement that can be evaluated as true or false. More specifically, the hypothesis is what we call a value condition value. A value being any number, so something like 0, 3, 55.7, negative 3,000, and so on. A value is any number, or it's a function that returns a value from the associated Sqwee. So when I say the associated Sqwee, I mean the Sqwee to which the brain tree belongs. And when I say a function that returns a value from the Sqwee, I mean something like how much energy does our Sqwee currently have? What's its x coordinate or its y coordinate? What's its speed? And so on. So a value is either a number or it's a function that returns a number from the associated Sqwee. A condition, meanwhile, is something like greater than, less than equal to, greater than equal to. So a hypothesis, recall, is value condition value. And that will work out to be something like 503 less than 3. Obviously, that evaluates to false. 503 is not and never will be less than 3. So that hypothesis would always evaluate to false. And that would be a pretty useless hypothesis to have. But other hypotheses might be more useful. For example, if your x coordinate was greater than 1500, that might indicate that you are on the right-hand side of the screen or of the tank. If your energy was less than 500, that might indicate that you were getting low on energy. So some hypotheses could be very meaningful to the world of the Sqwee, or to the Sqwee. But the hypotheses, when we start, are all going to be generated at random. So some of them are going to be completely useless, like 50 less than 100. That's a completely useless hypothesis. But some of them will be more useful. So let's talk about the other parts of the node. We have our hypothesis, and we understand how we can test that hypothesis. We evaluate the hypothesis to see if it produces a true or false. So when we ask our brain to make a decision, we start with this root node of the brain tree. And we say, root node of the brain tree, is your hypothesis true or false? If the hypothesis evaluates to true, then we just continue down the true branch. Execution proceeds down the true branch of the brain tree. If the hypothesis evaluates to false, execution proceeds down the false branch. And in this way, execution will continue recursively down the tree, meaning we start at the root branch, and then we repeat the same procedure down the root node's true branch or false branch until we come to the end of the tree. And at the end of the tree, on the leaf nodes of the tree, the final nodes of the tree with no true or false branch, what we have instead of brain nodes are values. And these are the same values that we make use of in our hypotheses. That is, these are either numbers, 50, 75, negative 9,000, whatever, or they are functions that return a number from the associated Sqwee. So once we use our brain tree to produce a number, we can then turn that number into an action for the Sqwee. So the Sqwee has 6 distinct actions: up, down, left, right, stop, or feed. So if the number is something like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, we can just pick the 0th, first, second, third, fourth, whatever action that's available to us. If the number that our brain tree produces is something like 5,335, then we'll just pick 5,335 mod the length of our actions list. Or another easy way to think about it is we would pick the 5,335th action as if we just counted down the list of actions 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on until we got to 5,335th, and then we would pick that action. So our brain tree can produce an action for us. So our brain tree will have both, I don't want to say hard-coded, but it will have both literal values built into it and relative values from the Sqwee. And that brain tree will be able to pick a decision for the Sqwee. So let's look and see how Sqwee with brains do. As we can see, our brainy Sqwee are going to begin their stay in the tank by doing stuff that's crazy, dumb, and suicidal. Many Sqwee just ram the walls at full speed. Sqwee don't eat, and they stay perfectly still. They just starve to death and die. And lots of Sqwee die out. But some Sqwee may survive. Some Sqwee may do something reasonably intelligent. They may move around and eat. And while they're moving and eating, they'll consume lots of red food bricks. They'll gain lots of energy, and so they'll duplicate a lot. And these Sqwees, when they duplicate, they'll produce children that are almost exactly the same as them. Now, when I say almost exactly, that almost comes from the fact that when we duplicate a Sqwee, we're going to copy its brain tree, so that the original Sqwee continues on with its brain tree, and the duplicate Sqwee will continue on with a copy of the parent's brain tree. But there's an error percent when we copy. A percentage chance that each element we copy will be copied incorrectly. And when I say element, the elements are things like the nodes of the brain tree, the true branch, the false branch, but also the hypothesis and the values and conditions in the hypothesis. So if a value is copied incorrectly, it will mutate by a fixed amount. If the value is a literal number, it'll mutate by a specific amount, either a random value between -3 and 3, uniformly distributed. So it may do as much as triple or negative triple in value, or it may shrink by having a value less than 1. It may increase by any factor between -3 and 3. If the value is a function, then it will just get randomly reassigned. It used to be get your x position, now it will be get how much energy the Sqwee has. It used to be get your y position. The true and false branch, if they mutate, they will point to either a new randomly generated node, or they'll point to a randomly generated value, meaning they would end the brain tree right there. So in this way, productive Sqwee, useful Sqwee that behave somewhat intelligently will have more offspring, more descendants, or more duplicates. And those duplicates will have variations. And some of those variations will be harmful. You may see that Sqwee coming from a successful Sqwee will just shoot off, stuck flying to the right or to the left or up or down, or stand perfectly still, no longer doing anything useful. But other Sqwee are going to become more useful than their parents were, or more successful than their parents were. And they, in turn, are going to have more children. And so in this way, evolution will start to apply to the Sqwee, and the Sqwee will become more and more productive. Actually, when we run this simulation a few times, we see that it's likely for the brainy Sqwee to die out in the very beginning. In fact, only about 1 out of 10 simulations with the brainy Sqwee will result in a stable Sqwee population. The other Sqwee simulations tend to result in all the Sqwees dying out immediately. And this is because if we're just unlucky at the beginning and no Sqwee has the bright idea to move and eat, then all the Sqwee are just going to die out. They either eat all the food around them, and then they're just stuck trying to eat empty space, or they're not even trying to eat at all, or they ram the walls at high speeds, which hurts the Sqwee, and they just die. Or we may find, oddly, that sometimes the Sqwee are very successful and they eat all the food at the beginning, and then they just die out because there's no food left and it doesn't replenish fast enough for them. But every once in a while, about 1 time out of 10, the Sqwee get by this great filter at the beginning and will evolve into a stable population. And once the Sqwee get past this filter, they'll live pretty much indefinitely, the brainy Sqwee. So we can take the simulation out to 1,000,000 turns, 1,000,000 iterations of the simulation, and see that our Sqwee still survive. And when we see the Sqwee at the 1,000,000 turns mark, we see that they've developed some useful behaviors. They'll stop themselves before they hit the edge of the tank. They'll move back and forth horizontally across the tank, horizontally because that's where they have the opportunity to run into the most food, and they kind of oscillate up and down so that they run across even more food. And we see that they've learned to, for the most part, only try to eat when there is food nearby them. The Sqwee also have a food sense that tells them if there is food nearby them that they could successfully eat. So the Sqwee have learned to make use of that and only eat food, because trying to eat food when there's none there is a costly operation. That will take some of their energy as well. So visually, we can see that the Sqwee's brain is actually helping them. The brainy Sqwee, when they survive, behave very much different than our random Sqwee. But we can also see that the brain is helping them, or the brain is doing something, if we look at some measurements of the Sqwee. So we can have our random Sqwee possess a brain, but their brain is just disconnected. Their brain doesn't control their actions, it just exists. And we can see what happens to the brain's complexity over time. The complexity of the brain, meaning it's just a number of how many nodes are in the brain tree, the complexity of the brain falls very quickly from where we randomly start it, and that's because random mutations have a very good chance of disconnecting the Sqwee's brain. Each node, each true or false branch, may become a value, and that will just make the brain much shorter and smaller. And so if there's no selection pressure to keep the size of the brain is just going to disconnect over time and become useless. And in the random Sqwee, where the brain isn't used at all, we see that it very quickly drops to a very small size, drops to about 3 nodes. Conversely, with the brainy Sqwee, we see that while their brain structure does also decrease in size, they retain a much greater brain size than the random Sqwee. At 100,000 turns, the Sqwee retain a brain size of over 100 nodes, and after 1,000,000 turns, the Sqwee's brain size is still above 30 nodes. So clearly there's a strong selection pressure to keep brain size in the brainy Sqwee relative to the random Sqwee. Another thing we can see is the Sqwee's age over time. Brainy Sqwee don't have the same lifespan over time. Our random Sqwee are always going to live about the same number of turns, and that makes sense because they're always doing about the same thing. That is, they're always randomly moving and dying when they run out of food. Our brainy Sqwee, by contrast, at the beginning are going to be doing something pretty silly or pretty random, pretty meaningless. But over time, they'll develop a better strategy. And as they develop this better and better strategy, we see that their age trends up. This graph shows the average age of the Sqwee at different points in time, and that black line is a trend line showing that the average age of the Sqwee is increasing over time. The longer the Sqwee live, the more they evolve, the better strategies they develop, and the more successful the individual Sqwee become. So this is obviously a pretty simple first step towards creating something that is virtually alive. But I think it's a promising step. We have life and death, we have reproduction, and we have a brain that actually seems to kind of work. So for our next steps, we can increase the complexity of the brain. We could add loops within the brain, and that might introduce the danger of an infinite loop within the brain, which will penalize by causing Sqwee that develop that loop to die. But we could also introduce memory. So rather than just taking actions, the Sqwee could store things in their memory. and we could introduce short-term memory and long-term memory. We could have the Sqwee cooperate with each other or communicate with each other, or we could have them try to eat each other. We could have the Sqwee producing poisons or toxins in their environment, and we can develop different kinds of environments for them to live in. So I think there's a lot of potential for interesting things to do with the Sqwee and to make the Sqwee more interesting and more lifelike. We could give them better brains, more behavior, more interactions, make them increase or decrease in size, move faster or slower, reproduce in ways other than simply asexual division where they just duplicate themselves. The possibilities are endless. So if you're interested in this, project at all and you want to see some behavior from the Sqwee, why don't you say what you would like to see in the comments, and I'll see if we can work that into the next step of the simulation. And otherwise, you should like and subscribe so that you can see what happens next with the Sqwee. Thanks a lot for your time.